Miss Elizabeth Bennet has been staying at Hunsford Parsonage, visiting with her friend Mrs. Collins, formerly known as Charlotte Lucas. Mr. Darcy, whom she well knows, has been staying at Rosings Park, along with his cousin, the admirable Colonel Fitzwilliam. Lady Catherine has hosted her gatherings, and there they have shared in their conversations, much to an uneventful degree. Imagine the surprise, then, when Elizabeth receives a visit one day from Mr. Darcy, who is entirely alone. The moment is quite awkward. She takes the opportunity to question him on the subject of their hasty departure from Netherfield, and how the party is faring in London. Darcy provides little to no information, and Lizzie found that she was to receive no other answer. From here, the conversation goes adrift in the form of small talk, on either side calm and concise, until the moment when they were discovered by Mrs. Collins. Indeed, she's a bit shocked, and it causes Darcy to leave abruptly. Charlotte says to Elizabeth, "What can be the meaning of this?" Both are baffled. Darcy's behaviour in the following days, his odd attentions to Elizabeth and their chance encounters in the park, lead Mrs. Collins to believe that it must be some kind of affection. As unrealistic as it may seem, she asserts that Mr. Darcy must be in love with Elizabeth Bennet. It comes to pass that Elizabeth finds herself in conversation with Colonel Fitzwilliam. They talk on a variety of subjects, until one in particular captures Lizzie's fullest attention. Mr. Bingley happens to be known of by the Colonel, and Elizabeth points out his connection to Mr. Darcy. She says to him, "Oh yes, Mr. Darcy is uncommonly kind to Mr. Bingley, and takes a prodigious deal of care of him." Colonel Fitzwilliam answers, "Yes, I really believe Darcy does take care of him in those points where he most wants care. From something that he told me in our journey hither, I have reason to think Bingley very much indebted to him. He's certain to make clear that the actual name and person of Bingley is only conjecture, but Lizzie is nonetheless compelled to ask, 'What is it that you mean?' He tells her, 'What he told me was merely this, that he congratulated himself on having lately saved a friend from the inconveniences of a most imprudent marriage, but without mentioning names or any other particulars. And I only suspected it to be Bingley from believing him the kind of young man to get into a scrape of that sort, and from knowing them to have been together the whole of last summer.'" Elizabeth had been listening carefully and made no answer, her heart swelling with indignation. It was a shameful boast on Darcy's part, the misery he had been able to inflict. It gave her a keen sense of her sister's sufferings. He was the cause. His pride and caprice were the cause of all that Jane had suffered and still continued to suffer. Jane's humble character, her want of connections, were preyed upon by Darcy's snobbish pride, combined with his wish of retaining Mr. Bingley for his sister, Georgiana. The monster. The agitation and tears which the subject occasioned brought on a headache for Lizzie, and thus it was horrible to find that Darcy himself was seeking her out at that very moment. After a perplexing silence of several minutes between them, he drew closer to her and confessed. "In vain have I struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. "You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." Elizabeth's astonishment was beyond expression. Darcy follows his confession with a crass discourse on social inferiority, which made a proposal of marriage all the more outrageous. Roused to resentment by the whole of his actions, she voiced what was patently necessary, that he had crushed her sister's feelings and destroyed her hopes, and that his behaviour towards Wickham was unspeakable. Darcy is dumbfounded, as it was for him to understand clearly that she had not known him a month before she felt that he was the last man in the world whom she could ever be prevailed upon to marry. Next morning, Darcy finds Elizabeth to give her a letter that he's written. Darcy's ability to write is consummate, and it stands to reason that, in the case of his responsibility towards the size of his estate, in conjunction with all the legal matters that he must deal with in that regard, the letter has been constructed with great precision. His method of operation is to tackle Elizabeth's charges against him as someone would a case in a court of law, going so far as to defer to the testimony of Colonel Fitzwilliam for support in determining the veracity of his defence. First, he defines the two offences, and then he addresses them one by one. His defence as to the claim of offending Jane is that, in essence, he has no defence which could be described as altogether noble. His perception of the Bennet family is suggestive of inappropriately digging for gold. And his opinion of Jane is that her behaviour towards Bingley had been lacklustre at best. He mitigates his actions by drawing the Bingley sisters into the mix as co-conspirators, in order to remove Mr. Bingley from Jane's influence. Darcy claims that he was merely seeking to protect Bingley from an imprudent situation that could have incurred negative, if not lifelong repercussions. Darcy stands his ground by admitting that although his motives may seem insufficient, in light of the outcome for Jane, his behaviour was justified in the service of a friend. Darcy's defence as to the claim of ruining Mr. Wickham is based on Elizabeth's misunderstanding of the situation. He points out that while, indeed, he had known Wickham throughout the duration of his upbringing, and that the man was loved by his father, Wickham himself came to develop habits that were unprincipled. Proof of this behaviour was discovered in the form of actions which caused Wickham to blow £3,000 worth of money that Darcy had given him. Wickham had the nerve to ask for more, and when rejected, he proceeded to zero in on Darcy's sister Georgiana, whose fortune was worth £30,000. Luckily for Darcy and his sister, the endeavour failed due to Georgiana's eventual common sense. She chose to reject Wickham, and he was left to fend for himself. It is this case in which the testimony of Colonel Fitzwilliam is to support. And Mr. Darcy, after having written all that he felt was necessary, closes out the letter by both recognising how much Elizabeth might despise him, and by humbly conveying the lofty phrase, "God bless you." Upon reading this letter, Elizabeth's reaction is difficult to describe. It is mostly comprised of disbelief. And when she read and reread the letter with the closest attention, she was forced to hesitate. Elizabeth firstly begins to feel that while Darcy's actions pertaining to Bingley were not exactly wholesome, there might be some merit to his position on the Wickham problem. Here she begins to undergo a psychic change which she is forced to experience, because Mr. Darcy has done so well in stating his case, backed by the testimony of his own cousin whose credibility has never been in question. Had she been wrong about her feelings? Elizabeth begins to feel anxious and she scrutinizes the letter to the extent that she even begins to believe that Darcy may well have been right about Jane and Bingley. She's always felt the impropriety of her family's behavior with regard to the subject of marriage and money, but now she begins to view it all from a different point of view. Elizabeth feels herself mortified. How god-awful it all must have looked, the brashness of her mother, the wildness of her sisters. And now the matter of Wickham was coming sharp into focus. All bets were off. Delving deep within, Elizabeth mercilessly insists to herself, "How despicably have I acted?" Is this the end for Elizabeth Bennet? Is there work to be done to rectify the state of these misunderstandings? Or will the matter devolve into a permanent stain on her character that she must have been wrong about everything and she hadn't even realized it? Booktime Learning is dedicated to the study of writing and literature. If this video has been helpful in any way, please consider supporting our channel by clicking the like button and subscribing. And thank you for watching.